Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final installment of our workshop series on managing orchards for climate-friendly outcomes. My name is Nathan Peltier. I'm an ecological economist and industrial ecologist. I work as an assistant professor in the faculties of biology and management at the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan. As we begin, let me first acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated in the territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation and their peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge that this series is brought to you by the BC Food Web. The BC Food Web is a web portal project which aims to increase access and connection to current research and other resource materials. In addition, it aims to encourage innovation between farmers and researchers for future project collaborations. Today is the final day of our three-part workshop series, and the focus of today's workshop is life cycle modeling of agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. I'm going to begin our session with a brief overview of why life cycle thinking and a related modeling tool called life cycle assessment really are essential to helping us to understand the potential efficacy of agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. We will then have two speakers, Nicole Bamber and Alyssa Smart, who will present their research of two specific strategies: the use of bark mulch as a soil cover and the implementation of water-efficient irrigation systems for improving the climate friendliness of horticulture here in the Okanagan Valley. After each panelist gives a brief presentation, we will then move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have questions for the panelists, please navigate to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel and share them with us. Also, feel free to upvote others' questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. Now, I suspect I'm already preaching to the converted, but as a collective reminder as to why greenhouse gas mitigation in the agri-food sector is so important, and to frame, frankly, the enormity of the task at hand, I'd like to draw your attention to an article that was recently published in the journal Science by Michael Clark and colleagues. We already know that in total, food systems contribute as much as 1/3 of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a shared global ambition of limiting climate change to no more than 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. According to the authors of this recent study, and I quote, "Even if fossil fuel emissions were immediately halted, current trends in global food systems would prevent the achievement of the 1.5 degree target, and by the end of the century, threaten the achievement of the 2 degree target. Meeting the 1.5 degree target requires rapid and ambitious changes to food systems." Understandably then, there is a lot of scientific research being conducted to identify potential agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. If you attended the first 2 days of this webinar series, you'll have been treated to some examples of excellent scientific research undertaken in Okanagan orchards by UBC and AAFC researchers to understand how specific practices change greenhouse gas emissions in orchards. But before we begin to promote any specific practices, even if they demonstrate reduced emissions in orchards, we also have to consider that modern agricultural activities, such as the production of fruit, are invariably embedded in and enabled by complex, interconnected industrial supply chains. Accordingly, any changes in orchard level technologies or management strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions may also change both the kinds and the amounts of inputs to and outputs from orchards and the related supply chain activities, along with any associated greenhouse gas emissions. For this reason, the process of choosing between available strategies and of understanding which are actually most efficacious in reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions is in reality very challenging. In response to the necessity of accommodating this kind of complexity in decision-making, a concept called life cycle thinking has emerged really as the cornerstone of contemporary sustainability science. Simply put, life cycle thinking refers to adopting a systems-level perspective, not only to enable selecting the most resource efficient or the least emissions intensive production practices, but also to identify what are the greatest opportunities to leverage more efficient outcomes at a systems level, while assuring that we are attentive to potential trade-offs, whether trade-offs occur between different stages along the supply chain or across different aspects of sustainability that we are seeking to manage. In turn, life cycle assessment has become the leading methodology for formalizing life cycle thinking in the evaluation of technology and management alternatives. It provides a framework for, first, systematically compiling an inventory of all of the resource inputs, outputs, and emissions that are associated with activities along the supply chains of production systems, and subsequently, for utilizing an established suite of impact assessment methods to quantify how and to what extent that inventory of flows contributes to different kinds of resource and environmental impacts, including climate change. Life cycle thinking and assessment really are essential in support of identifying effective agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, because if we don't think at a systems level, and if we don't make our choices based on systems level efficacy, we very much run the risk of choosing solutions that actually do not enable us to get where we ultimately want to go. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Nicole Bamber. Nicole is one of my PhD students who is currently studying the coupled environmental and nutritional impacts of Canadian field cropping systems. However, she previously completed her Master of Science research on the environmental impacts of bark mulch use on Okanagan apple orchards, and she will share this work with us today. So over to you, Nicole.
Great, thank you, Nathan. All right, so today I will be talking about my master's thesis on the net life cycle environmental impacts of wood chip and bark mulch use on an Okanagan apple orchard, including the displaced alternative uses of the wood and bark chips. I will start by outlining the context of my research, highlighting the potential beneficial and detrimental environmental impacts of mulch. Then I will introduce the conceptual framework, or build upon the conceptual framework that Nathan introduced of life cycle assessment. And then I will present my specific research questions, methodology, and results using LCA to assess the impacts of mulch. Finally, I will share the conclusions and recommendations that I drew from my research. Broadly, I work in the field of food system sustainability, and as a whole, food systems contribute between 19 and 29% of all human greenhouse gas emissions. That includes the agricultural stage of food production, as well as everything that feeds into it. For example, the production of fertilizers, pesticides, etc., that are used on a farm, as well as everything that occurs after, so including the distribution, use, end of life, etc., of the agricultural products. More specifically, my master's research focused on apple orchards, and the most important emissions to consider for this system are nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, which are greenhouse gases. Food systems are responsible for 84% of all human nitrous oxide, or N2O, emissions, which is a greenhouse gas 300 times more powerful than CO2. Agricultural soils are also an important potential carbon sink. So another consideration for orchards is carbon sequestration, which refers to the process of CO2 in the atmosphere being taken up by plants and stored in the agricultural soils and not being re-released. By doing this, atmospheric CO2 levels can decrease due to this carbon that is sequestered in the soil. According to the 4 per 1,000 initiative, if we increase agricultural soil carbon sequestration by 0.4% per year, it can counteract human carbon emissions. So this is a very important consideration. Previous field level experiments in the agricultural greenhouse gas project showed that adding mulch to an experimental apple orchard at the Summerland Research and Development Center in the Okanagan Valley of British Columbia reduced nitrous oxide emissions and increased soil carbon content. Mulch is commonly used in plant production systems for a variety of other benefits, including water retention and weed suppression. Due to the nature of the experiments that were previously carried out, only the greenhouse gas benefits of mulch were assessed in my thesis. So despite the observed greenhouse gas reductions on the apple orchard with mulch application, there may be trade-offs at other points in the supply chain of apple production. Before the orchard, there are the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other emissions and resource use associated with the production, transportation, and application of the mulch. On the orchard, mulch use could impact other greenhouse gases or other types of emissions or yield. In addition, increased mulch use on orchards could mean decreased use in other industries, for example, bioenergy production. This could lead to an increase in energy produced in other ways, for example, using fossil fuels, in order to keep up with demand. In order to assess all of these different trade-offs, a methodology called life cycle assessment was used. Life cycle assessment, or LCA, is a sustainability assessment framework that considers all inputs and outputs along the entire supply chain or life cycle of a product, including material extraction, manufacturing, transportation, production, and sometimes use and disposal of the product. LCA is used to quantify all resource inputs and emission outputs throughout this life cycle, in this case for apple production, in order to assess its overall environmental impacts. This is useful to examine the impacts throughout the supply chain of adding mulch to the apple orchard and to avoid burden shifting between impacts in different life cycle stages. LCA is a multi-criteria assessment, meaning it can quantify a wide variety of environmental impacts rather than focusing on just one, for example, a carbon footprint. This means that using LCA, we can assess the different types of environmental impacts that are influenced by mulch production, transportation, and application on the orchard. My overall research objective was to determine the environmental sustainability of mulch use on apple orchards. Specifically, my first goal was to determine the life cycle environmental impacts of apple production with and without mulch, as well as the key contributors to those impacts. This was done using a type of LCA called attributional LCA, which is used to examine a static snapshot of how a product system currently is, in this case, apple production. My second goal was to determine the impacts of increased mulch use on orchards, taking into account potentially displaced alternative uses of the mulch. This was done using consequential LCA, which is a change-based assessment, including all processes that would be affected by a change. In this case, an increase in mulch use on orchards, leading to a subsequent decrease in uses and the other uses of mulch. For my attributional LCA, most of the orchard data came from the apple orchard experiments carried out previously in the AGGP project by Fentibil et al. For those experiments, apple production was separated into 4 different experimental treatments by varying the mulch and nitrogen fertilizer application rates. Nitrogen fertilizer was also included in the experiments because it is one of the important contributors to N2O emissions in agricultural systems. In this way, the researchers could examine the impacts of both mulch and nitrogen application on N2O emissions at the same time. So the treatments either had mulch or no mulch applied, and they also had either 20 or 40 grams of nitrogen fertilizer applied per tree, referred to as low or high nitrogen. All other orchard inputs were kept the same in all treatments. So this is a flow diagram representing the processes included in the attributional LCA. The light gray box represents the processes occurring directly on the orchard. Field level data were used for orchard inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, mulch, and water, as well as yield and emissions on the orchard. These data came either from the Fentanyl experiments or from field workers' logs. Some field level emissions were not measured, and these were modeled, for example, based on the inputs of fertilizer and pesticides. The long-term soil carbon sequestration impacts were also modeled based on the amount of carbon added to the soil in the mulch and using an estimate from a similar study of how much carbon would realistically stay sequestered in the soil. This was modeled as an input of CO2, assuming that the carbon in the soil was taken out of the air as CO2. The larger dark gray box represents the background processes which feed into the orchard. For these data, life cycle inventories from third-party databases were used to represent the processes rather than primary data collection. All these background processes have associated resource use and emissions that are accounted for in the databases. The orchard life cycle was modeled in the software OpenLCA, which is used to create linked product systems that include all environmental inputs and outputs along the supply chain. The basic model was copied 4 times to represent each of the 4 experimental treatments. Most processes remained the same, except for the inputs of fertilizer and mulch, as well as the associated emissions and resource use that changed as a result of the different fertilizer and mulch inputs. In order to determine the data needs for the consequential LCA, I administered surveys to local sawmills to determine where they sent their wood and bark chips. This was done because the mulch used in the Summerland apple orchard experiments was a mixture of wood and bark chips from local sawmills. From these surveys, I determined that the main alternative use of bark is for electricity and heat cogeneration, and the main use of wood chips is for paper production. Based on local industry reports, I also determined what processes would be used to produce these products if the wood and bark chips were not available. For cogeneration, to replace bioenergy from bark, electricity would be produced from BC Hydro, and heat would be produced from natural gas. For paper, recycled paper would be produced to replace paper produced from wood chips. Therefore, these product systems were also included in the consequential model, in addition to the orchard system, which was based on the attributional model. For the alternative uses of mulch, life cycle inventories from LCA databases were again used. So to explain the product systems, so using electricity production as an example, this is a simplified flow diagram of the consequential scenarios of apple production with and without mulch, including the displaced alternative uses. So in this example, mulch can either be used on the orchard or for bioenergy, which produces electricity as a product. This electricity can also be produced from BC Hydro. In the scenario in which no mulch is used on the orchard, apple production was modeled without mulch and electricity production from bark bioenergy was modeled. For the scenario in which mulch use increases on orchards, apple production was modeled with mulch. This increase in mulch use on the orchard means a decrease in availability for bioenergy production, and therefore a decrease in electricity produced from bark and an increase in electricity from BC Hydro. So to summarize those consequential scenarios, the no mulch scenario is apple production without mulch and electricity, heat, and paper production with mulch. The increased mulch scenario is apple production with mulch and electricity, heat, and paper production without mulch, instead from hydro, natural gas, and recycled paper. In addition, I also performed a sensitivity analysis on the choice of displaced uses of mulch. I created scenarios in which bark mulch for bioenergy was assumed to be substituted in either British Columbia or Washington, based on the survey results from the sawmills that indicated that bark biomass may be sent to either location for use in bioenergy production. Once the models were created, I used the OpenLCA software to calculate the life cycle environmental impacts of the scenarios. This was done by aggregating all relevant inputs and outputs of the product system for different categories of environmental impacts. For example, one impact category is climate change, which accounts for all greenhouse gas emissions throughout the life cycle, expressed as CO2 equivalents. So that would include all CO2 emitted during transportation, as well as the N2O emitted during the agricultural production, multiplied by 298 to get the CO2 equivalent of N2O, and continued for all greenhouse gases emitted in all life cycle processes. For the attributional model, this is a graph of the total CO2 equivalents emitted over the life cycle of apple production for the 4 different experimental treatments. Contrary to the previous experimental results, we see that apples produced with mulch have higher life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than those produced without mulch. So why is that? Here's a graph of the same data, but separated by orchard inputs and outputs. So we have fertilizer, irrigation, plant protection, energy, mulch, and greenhouse gas emissions. As seen in the experiments, there were slightly lower N2O emissions with mulch, as well as lower CO2 emissions due to the soil carbon sequestration. But these differences were small compared to other impacts such as fertilizer and irrigation. In addition, what we also have in the mulch models are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, transportation, and application of the mulch. For the most part, these come from the impacts of lumber production required to produce the wood and bark chips used as mulch based on the mass relationship between the lumber and chips produced. These greenhouse gas emissions also include those that come specifically from producing, transporting, and applying the chips on the orchard. The majority of these impacts were from life cycle electricity and fuel use associated with the mulch supply chain. These mulch life cycle emissions actually outweighed the orchard level reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, resulting in the higher overall life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for apples produced with mulch than without. A similar trend was seen across all impact categories, but for sake of time, I'm only presenting the results for greenhouse gases. In most impact categories, fertilizer contributed the most to the impacts, followed by mulch. This is in line with most agricultural systems, which generally have fertilizer as the largest contributor to environmental impacts due to on-farm emissions, as well as life cycle emissions and resource use from the production of the fertilizers. For mulch, the majority of the impacts were from the life cycle energy needed to produce the wood chips. Next, we have the results for the life cycle CO2 equivalent emissions from the consequential model. We have the scenario in which mulch is not used on the orchard and the scenario with increased mulch use on orchards. For each scenario, results are displayed for the production of 1 kilogram of apples, as well as the amount of paper, heat, and electricity that would be produced with the amount of mulch used to produce 1 kilogram of apples. Here we can see that despite the increased greenhouse gas emissions in the life cycle of apple production with mulch, there's an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the lower emissions from recycled paper production compared to paper production from wood chips. There are also relatively low emissions associated with electricity and heat production without bark bioenergy from BC Hydro and natural gas. However, if bioenergy production is assumed to be displaced in Washington rather than in BC, the electricity and heat production emissions without bark are now much higher due to the difference in electricity grid in that region, which includes fossil sources of energy. So to conclude, there were orchard level reductions in greenhouse gas emissions observed when using mulch on apple orchards, but these were outweighed by the life cycle emissions of mulch production. When considering the alternative uses of mulch, increasing mulch use on orchards could decrease or increase impacts depending on the location of the substituted electricity and heat production processes. This shows the value of assessing the sustainability of mulch use at all these scales, since each had a different conclusion. Since the results were fairly contradictory and inconclusive as to the sustainability of mulch, further research is required before making a recommendation for mulch application as a climate-friendly option on orchards. Looking at only the orchard life cycle and only the greenhouse gas benefits of mulch, the results do not support mulch use as an environmentally friendly practice. However, mulch has other benefits, such as water retention and weed suppression, which could lead to decreased inputs of irrigation water and pesticides. Further research is necessary to assess the changes in orchard emissions associated with these changes in inputs, which could then be integrated into another life cycle assessment. When taking into account the alternative uses of mulch, the most important factor determining the environmental impacts is the substituted energy production. So it is important to determine the local markets for electricity and heat to determine whether or not using mulch on orchards instead of as bioenergy is environmentally beneficial. And with that, I conclude and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm certain that your presentation has given our audience members a lot of food for thought, and I suspect that you are going to get some good questions in the Q&A session. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Alyssa Smart. Alyssa is a Master of Science student in my lab. She is currently almost wrapping up her research, comparing the environmental impacts associated with different irrigation technologies and infrastructure here in the Okanagan. So over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, so as Nathan said, my name is Alyssa Smart, and today I'll be talking about how I use life cycle assessment to look at irrigation infrastructure, which is the system used to deliver water to farms and orchards, as well as irrigation technologies that are employed on orchards in the Okanagan. I'll first go over my research goals using LCA, describe the data sources I used for my model, and then look at some graphs showing my model's results. Finally, we'll discuss the main takeaway points of this research. My research is focused on irrigation used in orchards, and I'm using LCA to fit my research questions into the context of the entire orchard system. So we know there are different irrigation technologies used on orchards, and each of these have a different water use efficiency associated with them because of the way they distribute water. In some cases, like handline, for example, the efficiency is as low as 70%, meaning only 70% of the water delivered actually remains in the soil for the roots of the crop to take up. The rest is wasted through evaporation and other pathways, whereas efficient irrigation technologies like drip or subsurface drip have efficiencies in the 92 to 95% range. So I'm interested in knowing what that means in terms of environmental impacts. Will these technologies have significantly different greenhouse gas emissions and water scarcity impacts when compared to each other? There is also where irrigation water comes from to consider. So how much pumping and treatment is required, what source of water is used. Normally, LCAs of agricultural systems use already made data sets to model the irrigation that flows into the farm or orchard. But we only have one Canadian data set for a water delivery system, and it's a Quebec data set that delivers tap water to domestic users. So I wanted to see if the emissions associated with irrigation on an orchard change when I use data for a water delivery system that is representative of the Okanagan. Not only do I want to see how it compares to the Quebec data set, I also want to see what processes within the delivery system contribute the most emissions. And it's important to see how both of these pieces, the irrigation infrastructure and irrigation technologies, fit into the context of the entire orchard system, including other inputs like fertilizer and machinery use, among others. The last piece of this research is to take the findings of other researchers in the agricultural greenhouse gas program and apply it in the context, again, of an entire orchard system. So back in 2016, this paper was published by other researchers in the AGG program that found bicarbonates from the Okanagan Lake are deposited into the soil of orchards through irrigation water, causing a reaction with calcium in soil that produces carbon dioxide gas. Of course, this is a very simplified version of the process, as anything that goes on below the surface in the soil is a complete mystery to me. But we know some CO2 is released, and we want to know whether that amount of CO2 released is significant compared to the total emissions produced by the orchard. So those research interests can be summarized into 4 research questions. The first is, how do impacts from irrigation technologies compare to each other? 2 is, what processes within the water delivery system contribute the most greenhouse gas emissions? The third is, how do the greenhouse gas emissions of irrigation infrastructure and technologies compare to the total greenhouse gas emissions from an orchard? And finally, will the carbonate in irrigation have a significant contribution to the total greenhouse gas emissions of an orchard? So the first system to create a model for is the water delivery system. This includes processes of pumping, treatment, if there is any treatment, the piping required to deliver the water, and finally the type of water. So whether it's surface from a lake or groundwater from a well. The data collected for this model therefore includes things like treatment chemicals, pipe materials, the leaks and water losses in the system, like flushing the system, and the electricity consumed from pumps in order to pump it. All of these inputs then get scaled to how much is required to deliver 1 cubic meter of water to an orchard. The orchard system I worked with is a cherry orchard. So you can see the irrigated water from the water delivery system is an input into this orchard, along with other inputs like fertilizers and plant protectants. These inputs are all scaled to how much is required to produce a kilogram of fruits, in this case cherries, ready for the market. I worked with 3 water purveyors, the town of Oliver, the regional district of North Okanagan, and the city of Kelowna, to collect data on 14 water delivery systems. Some inputs, like water treatment chemicals, have their own manufacturing processes prior to being an input to my system. It would be way too labor intensive for anyone to map out all of these processes, so LCA practitioners commonly use previously made data sets from a database called EcoInvent. I use EcoInvent data for all of the processes involved in making the inputs that are then used in the water delivery system, but how much of these inputs are used is the data I collect directly from water purveyors. So that's the same to say as what Nicole mentioned earlier about background data versus foreground data. The background data is coming from pre-made data sets, and the foreground information is coming from those water purveyors. I use the agricultural land use inventory from the Okanagan Basin Water Board to collect data on what irrigation technologies are actually used on cherry orchards in the Okanagan. And the cherry orchard model I used is from a previous student of Dr. Pelletier's, Tori Sanderson, who collected her data largely from the Coral Beach farms, which at the time I believe represented about 30% of the cherry production in the Okanagan. So the first 2 graphs we'll look at answer the first research question: how do the impacts associated with irrigation technologies compare to each other? The green graph shows us the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of cherries produced. And the blue graph shows the water scarcity impact in cubic meters of the world equivalent, again, scaled to how much irrigation is required to produce a kilogram of cherries. Along the y-axis are the different irrigation technologies in order of least efficient down to most efficient. So you can see the results are very intuitive, right? You have the most emissions and water scarcity associated with the least efficient technology up on the top there. And as the technology becomes more efficient and wastes less water, you see a decrease in impacts. Right in the middle are the 2 most common technologies employed on Okanagan cherry orchards, according to the Agricultural Land Use Inventory. If we were to convert the most common technologies over to the most efficient, which is SDI, subsurface drip, we would see a 22% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and water scarcity. So here we see the same numbers as the last graph, but with a breakdown of where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from within the system. So I used SDI and handline technologies to represent the best and worst case scenarios, as they have the best and worst efficiencies respectively. The average irrigation uses an efficiency that is based on the average mix of irrigation technologies used on cherry orchards in the Okanagan. So we can see the largest contributor is the treatment process, while the carbon dioxide produced from the carbonate in the irrigation water has a small but non-trivial contribution to the overall emissions. So that's the dark blue deposited carbonate on the graph. While it's not a large contributor, it's still clearly evident on the graph. If handline was switched to SDI, we'd see a 27% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. When we do the same process level breakdown for water scarcity, we see that the use of water and the loss of water through leaks and flushing the system contribute the most to water scarcity, with piping, pumping, and treatment having very small contributions. Again, intuitively, the impact of water scarcity is just exacerbated when more water is wasted using an inefficient technology. But how significant are these impacts at the orchard level? So this graph shows our different irrigation scenarios along with all the other inputs of the orchard. The added fourth bar at the top is the tap water data set from Quebec I mentioned earlier, which was used for the irrigation input to the cherry orchard prior to building the Okanagan water delivery system, which is what is used in the other three scenarios. So you can see fertilizer contributes the most to greenhouse gas emissions, but surprisingly, irrigation is a worthy contender in this case. In fact, in the case of having a very inefficient technology like handline, the greenhouse gas emissions produced from irrigation are equal to fertilizer inputs. Also note that the tap water data set is closest to our best case scenario for irrigation technology, which means that the data set underestimated the impacts of irrigation on the average cherry orchard, since the best case scenario of using SDI is quite uncommon. Now, if we have a look at how significant the carbonate deposited from irrigation is at the orchard level, we see that the carbon dioxide produced from the carbonate is about 1% of the total emissions associated with the orchard. So this means if we're looking for an emissions mitigation strategy on the orchard, addressing the carbonate found in irrigation water might not be the best place to start. Now, I just want to show you something unique that Sanderson did for her cherry orchard model. So she considered the emissions associated with air travel used to transport migrant workers to the Okanagan. When migrant worker transportation is taken into account, it accounts for half of the emissions of the orchard and bumps irrigation down to 11 to 14% of the overall emissions. So the main takeaway points of this research is that in a water delivery system, the water treatment contributes the most to greenhouse gas emissions, but the water losses like leaks and flushing and use contribute the most to water scarcity. When we look at the emissions associated with the orchard with employee transportation aside, we see that the greenhouse gas emissions from irrigation can be as large as fertilizer, ranging from 21 to 27% of orchard emissions. The carbon dioxide released from carbonate deposited in the soil by irrigation water contributes approximately 1% of the overall orchard emissions. And of course, when you take the employee transportation into account, that drops to less than 1%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, for that very interesting presentation. I can see a lot of questions are already popping up in the Q&A, so I'm going to pose those questions one by one, and I'll Some of them I'll answer myself, and some of them I will refer to either Alyssa or Nicole to answer. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to forward those questions. So the first question that we have, which will be a question for Nicole: did mulch application increase apple yield per unit area? And if so, by how much?
Thanks for that question. It did not change the yield significantly in the experiments that were carried out. However, that was not one of the main focuses of those experiments. So it's definitely could be worth doing at sort of a more long-term experimental trial of that. But in my results or in my model, no, the yields were functionally equivalent. There were small differences, but they were not significantly different at all.
Thank you, Nicole. The second question we have, also for Nicole: here in the Okanagan, given that our source of energy is mostly from hydro, your results show that there is an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when mulch is applied. Is that right?
That is right. That's yeah, exactly the conclusion to draw from that. So yeah, the reduction that we saw was from actually the paper production change. So producing paper from the wood is more emissions intensive than from recycled paper. And in BC, we have a lot of extra recycled paper. So or extra paper that could be recycled that is otherwise going to waste. So it's beneficial to use that paper rather than the wood. The energy was slightly higher from hydro than from bioenergy, I believe, but those are pretty equivalent. So yeah, when we get into those big increases is when we're using fossil fuel sources for the energy rather than hydro and natural gas.
Thank you. These are certainly complex interactions, and when developing these kind of models, of course, the modelers always do their best to identify the most realistic scenarios possible. And I would say in the case of Nicole's research, she's actually done quite a nice job because she was able to access data that was specifically reflective of conditions and interactions kind of at a regional or provincial economy scale. Of course, when you think about doing this kind of modeling at broader geographical scales, where those market interactions are more difficult to predict, it becomes increasingly challenging. A third question, and I think either Alyssa or Nicole could answer this question: how can we scale down life cycle modeling to take a look at our own processes on our own farms?
I can start. So actually, my model is looking at one farm. So it's really common for LCA to be a sort of a whole industry or a whole section of an industry. But you can scale it to anything you like. The difference with the consequential model is what I'm assuming in this increased mulch scenario that it's a large enough increase that it's going to actually change the markets. You know, if you're adding a few bags of mulch, that's probably not going to drastically change the market. So that's sort of something to consider as well. But it's definitely possible to scale it to whatever scale you like. And other researchers in our lab are also working on a farm tool that is like that. That's for egg production systems, so not directly related. But yeah, it's very possible. Nathan, you know more about nests than I do, but I just know that's being produced.
Yeah, we can certainly use these kind of models to build tools that farmers can utilize on their own farms to enter farm-specific data and generate farm-specific impact estimates across a whole variety of different resource and emissions-related environmental indicators. I think one very useful application, and perhaps the most useful application when thinking about what this means for your own farm and when reading and interpreting results from studies like this, is that they really enable us to understand where we should focus our efforts if we want to reduce emissions. So when I look at Nicole's results, clearly, precision agricultural strategies that are going to enable more efficient nitrogen management are really important, right? That is probably the most important area of focus for orchards? How can we use nitrogen more efficiently? Of course, that will have the added benefit of making orchards more profitable, because of course, nitrogen is an expensive input. Similarly, from Alyssa's work, and this is really nice because we haven't seen any of this kind of work previously in Canada, and I think even internationally, work done at the level that Alyssa has done using the quality of data that she was able to access is really rare. And it was surprising for me, frankly, just to see how environmentally relevant the use of irrigation water actually is. So again, with respect to producing fruit in the Okanagan in a more climate-friendly way, identifying ways to use water more efficiently really matters. And of course, we already know that the less commonly utilized technologies like SDI irrigation would be quite efficacious. We also know that at the level of the distribution system now, we really need to tackle those tremendous losses of water. I can't remember exactly, I think it was 23%. Is that right, Alyssa? If we could even reduce those emissions by half, that will have a large impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with fruit production in this region.
And just to add to that, sorry, just getting a little backlash there. A lot of those values for the greenhouse gas emissions, they're based on the efficiencies of the technology, right? But that is basically saying if you use more water, you're getting more greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't mean that the only way to mitigate those emissions is to change your irrigation technology. That's a good place to start. And there's quite a big jump once you go from anything like sprinklers or hand lines up to microspray or drip. But there's also other ways. There's irrigation scheduling and water management in that context that also reduces water, and you'll see the same benefits that is shown in the graphs.
Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, we have a fourth question here. Again, this question looks like it's specific to Nicole's work. So results on greenhouse gas emissions of bark mulch were conflicting based on the boundaries of the analysis. Which boundaries should we consider? Is this a drawback of all LCAs?
That's a really interesting question. I personally think that it is really important to consider that consequential expanded boundaries that I did consider, because we don't exist in a void of just the farm. Like, it does impact other things. So I think it is important to take that into consideration. The issue that can arise with that is the accuracy of the data that you're using. So mine is very specific to this system. I was contacting local sawmills, looking at local industry documents to determine exactly what sort of things would be changed. So if you don't have that level of precision in your decision making, it can be quite uncertain and you might be making sort of erroneous choices. So I think that scale is very important, but if you don't have the data to support it, then a smaller scale might be more accurate and more understandable. So yeah, that is kind of a thing in LCAs, is determining the system boundaries, and it depends on the questions you're asking. Like, if it's a very specific thing, like just your farm, like I was saying, like it's probably not likely to have like large market ripple effects. But if we're talking about sort of a wide industry change, if we're going to make, let's say we were to make a recommendation for all apple orchards to use mulch, then that would be very important then to consider what alternative uses are being displaced.
Yeah, it was an excellent response, Nicole. I think you really hit the nail on the head, that the boundaries really have to be chosen contingent on the kind of questions that are being asked, and then the potential scale of the interaction. Our fifth question, this is a question for Alyssa. I think you've already actually answered this question very well, but there may be other things you'd like to add, so I'm going to ask it anyways. What are other potential mitigation strategies specifically for emissions from irrigation water?
Yeah, so again, anything that you're actually reducing the volume of water, so that can be in irrigation scheduling. There's a lot of publications that show that scheduling is actually really important in conserving water on orchard systems. The other thing from the water delivery system point of view is having separated agricultural lines. So in some cases, the water delivery systems for agricultural users were completely separated. They didn't have to go through the same amount of treatment in order to, which is required for domestic users for tap water. And as we saw in one of the graphs, the largest contributor in the water delivery system to greenhouse gas emissions was the treatment process. So if we're able to avoid that altogether, even taking into account having to put in new piping infrastructure over time, that still reduces emissions because we're not having to treat all of the water that goes through that system if it's just going to agricultural users. So it's not as much on the farm, but that is the biggest greenhouse gas emission associated with the water delivery system, aside from on-farm ways of using less water.
Thanks, Alyssa. Our next question addresses the interactions that were accounted for, Nicole, in your model. Regarding nitrogen inputs, typically the use of mulch can require higher use of nitrogen to compensate for the mulch nitrogen uptake. Was this accounted for?
No, that was not accounted for in the experimental design. They just had that 2x2 treatment. So it was either mulch or no mulch, and then either the 20 grams or the 40 grams of nitrogen. So that interaction could explain some different interaction effects between the two. So if there was more nitrogen with the mulch versus less nitrogen with the mulch, that might change the emissions. But that was not included in my model. Instead, well, it was not explained in my model. I used the data from the experiments, but I didn't like factor that into the model itself. I just used the nitrogen emissions that they found. So that is definitely something to look into in the future, and that could be done using that experimental data potentially. But that was not explicitly included in my model, no.
One of the benefits of building models of the kind that Nicole has built here is that they can be iteratively improved and expanded upon over time to answer precisely those kind of questions. And actually we saw that with Alyssa's work and her ability to integrate a model that had been developed for orchard production systems in the Okanagan, but without using irrigation infrastructure that was specifically developed as a model to represent Okanagan conditions. Alyssa, our next couple of questions are for you. The first, is there an interrelationship between evapotranspiration losses with CO2 emissions?
I think the main source of CO2 emissions came from the carbonate. There are N2O emissions associated with how water is distributed. So it was found in another paper, I think coming out of a California orchard system, that drip, because it saturates the soil to a higher level, it actually allows for, I believe it's bacteria that switch over to a system that ends up producing nitrous oxide. And so how the water is distributed according to different irrigation technologies can actually change things going on in the soil and produce different emissions associated with them. That isn't integrated into my model at the moment because it is challenging to have values that are represented in a different orchard system, and then finding a way to integrate them into this cherry orchard system, which of course is different, and what's going on under the soil is going to be very different as well. But in short, to answer that question, yeah, how the water is distributed does play a factor into the types of emissions that can be released.
Thank you, Alyssa. Yes, and again, if Okanagan specific research of nitrous oxide emissions in cherry orchards as a function of irrigation technology or moisture in the soil is conducted, then that data can be integrated into Alyssa's current model and answer those specific questions. Alyssa, another question for you. You mentioned that greenhouse gas emissions from irrigation can be as large as fertilizer, but if we could only reduce one of these inputs, which would you recommend we start with?
Fertilizer typically has higher inputs, higher greenhouse gas emissions in other LCAs. I guess it's what is most operational. So with the irrigation water, the largest contributions to that come from the type of delivery system it's coming from, whether it's treated or not, which is out of the control of a farmer. So I would go with those two in those cases being fairly equal, whichever is more operationally feasible. So reductions in fertilizer, in nitrogen fertilizer, is going to make a large contribution, and so is reductions in irrigation. So it is really context specific. And in the case of cherry orchards, if you are using handline, I would say definitely go and switch to drip. You'll get a large reduction in emissions. But if you're using a system that's already fairly efficient, then it might be nitrogen fertilizer in that case that has a higher chance for mitigation.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we would want to carefully consider if either of those pathways would impact on yields, because of course, given that yield is the unit of analysis against which all of these impacts are scaled, any reductions in yields would significantly change the life cycle impacts. It's also really important to remember here, I mean, this work was funded by the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Program and focused largely on greenhouse gas emissions. The tool life cycle assessment itself is actually a multi-criteria tool, and we saw that to some extent in the work that was presented looking at some other environmental criteria, for example, water scarcity. But we can and should always expand that out to really carry out a multi-criteria analysis. And in fact, both Nicole and Alyssa are reporting, in terms of their published manuscripts, analyses that contain 5 to 10 discrete environmental indicators. And when we think about, well, which pathway should we choose? If we choose only one, we should really look across the results for those different environmental criteria and choose the one where we are going to see the greatest synergies and the least unacceptable trade-offs. A big question for either of you. Conventional farm business cost benefit models do not account for externalities or collateral damage as LCA does. Do you envision a societal system that allows a farmer to incorporate external costs and benefits? How do you suggest an individual farm account for this? That's a big question. I can, go ahead, Alyssa.
I think this was touched on, but I guess having tools developed for farmers to actually do this would be the only way I could foresee something like that being available.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the individual who asked this question touched on a really important point. I mean, historically, and even now, most of our decisions are based on economic information that does not include these kind of negative environmental interactions that are external to market transactions. And that's profoundly problematic with respect to our decision making, because we increasingly need to explicitly figure sustainability into our decisions if we want to grapple with things like climate change. So ideally, we will increasingly move towards decision-making models that are always informed by life cycle thinking, by these kind of analyses that really enable us to understand and to weigh the costs and benefits of different decision pathways. I mean, if we don't do that, we are unable to make effective decisions for sustainability objectives. Another question from our audience. are costs ever considered in life cycle analyses? And I can answer this one. So the tool that both Alyssa and Nicole are using is called environmental life cycle assessment. It is one of many tools that have been developed based on life cycle thinking. And there are other tools that are explicitly intended to help us understand a variety of different socioeconomic interactions when we look at product systems, as well as to look at costs. I would say that the framework that we have for evaluating the distribution of costs, which is called life cycle costing, is probably the weakest of the three major life cycle tools right now, because it enables us to map the distribution of costs throughout the life cycle of a product system. But in terms of how that actually informs the kind of decisions that we make, it's not as obvious as with studies that tell us, well, what are the social risks or benefits of specific interactions, or what are the environmental risks or benefits. In fact, one of my PhD students, Vivek, just recently wrote a very nice paper where he proposes to expand the current methods for life cycle costing to incorporate a variety of other economic indicators that provide more relevant information to our decision making with respect to costs. Melanie has volunteered in the chat. This is Melanie Jones, who was a lead researcher in the agricultural greenhouse gas project research that's been presented over the past 3 days. An answer to Paul's final question. In the Fentanyl 8L study, methane was measured along with CO2 and N2O, but was almost undetectable in all treatments in the Summerland orchard where the experiment was run. So thank you for that, Melanie. Another question for Alyssa. When considering irrigation systems, it's important to bear in mind drive row and undercrop vegetation cover. So weeds and grasses can be an important C-sink, which is difficult to quantify and is typically, I think, not taken into account in a life cycle assessment. Alyssa, do you agree with that? Do you have anything to add in reply to that point?
This is, sorry, what's going on in the rows, not in the actual, like, under the tree.
Mm-hmm. So I think the point that is being made here is that the drive rows can be particularly important as carbon sinks. And the point is that this may or may not have been taken into account in prior life cycle analyses, including yours.
I think in the cherry orchard model, it is taken into account to some degree with the orchard setup and just the acreage being converted from whatever terrain it was before to the cherry orchard system. But aside from that, yeah, I'm not sure if it would have been included as a C-sink, the rows themselves.
Okay. That'll probably be a question that some of our other project partners would be well positioned to answer. The next question. You mentioned the impacts to climate change of your research findings, but what are the other impacts that we should consider?
Yeah, so there are several other emissions that are important on orchards, as well as different energy and resource uses. And these are also, of course, going to be different depending on the system you're working in. So I'm just going to talk about the system for my specific work. So I also considered the energy use, both renewable and non-renewable energy use throughout the life cycle, as well as resource use, so biotic and abiotic resources, so like fossil fuels, things like that as resources throughout the life cycle. And then in terms of emissions, other important emissions on the orchards are acidification and eutrophication. So those can have other detrimental environmental impacts in addition to climate change. Those are important ones, and as well as toxicity. So some of the pesticides can release toxins. So that's another important environmental impact. So like I said, I saw a pretty similar trend through all of the impact categories in terms of the no mulch versus mulch treatments, which was higher. So I only presented the one just for sort of continuity time's sake. But yeah, there's more of all of the resource use and emissions with the mulch treatments, again, due to those increases in emissions and resource use, energy use in the life cycle of producing the mulch.
Thanks, Nicole. All right, the next question is, bark mulch is thought to potentially reduce nitrous oxide emissions, which was really, an observation that motivated the current analysis to understand how relevant that reduction would be compared to the emissions associated with the production and use of that mulch. But if not bark mulch, are there alternatives that could provide a similar functionality, but potentially have lower impacts?
I'm definitely not an expert on that. In the treatment, it was either mulch or just not mulch. So that was the direct comparison, and that's what is being modeled. But there's also different types. You could have like a plastic type mulch, like a recycled plastic, or a compost type that would also give more nutrients, which would have, maybe you could also reduce fertilizer inputs, things like that with that. But I'm not super familiar with all of the different soil amendments that orchardists might be using. Yeah, so that would also then warrant another life cycle assessment into each of those to see how the production of those things would impact, and also where they're coming from, what they're replacing. So yeah, definitely cannot give a simple answer to that right now.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the key take-home points from the research that was presented today, is that yes, there are many alternatives, but we really need to think about the life cycle consequences of those alternatives, before we make any decisions. And Nicole has added to our knowledge with respect to one potential soil cover. But if we are going to potentially use others, then we need to conduct similar analyses to understand what are the benefits, what are the potential trade-offs. So that segues very nicely into what will be the final question for our webinar today. And this is, I'll ask both Alyssa and Nicole to reply in turn. What was the most important finding from this work from each of your perspectives?
I can go first. So I would say my most important finding was that those observed differences in greenhouse gases, which were, like Nathan said, one of the reasons for doing this research, were very small in comparison to the larger system impacts. So that's of the production of the mulch and also of the displaced energy use. So yeah, the biggest takeaway is that there are things outside of the orchard that have really large impacts. So that should be considered when making decisions on the orchard.
Takeaway from my research, I think there's two. One is that irrigation can have high impacts when you look at the entire orchard system, which I think have been underestimated previously and not thought of as emitting much greenhouse gases compared to fertilizers and other inputs. But it is important. And so I think that's the first takeaway. And the second would be that how much emissions are associated with the irrigation water really depends on whether or not that water delivery system is separated for agricultural versus domestic. So whether it's going through a treatment plant unnecessarily.
Certainly a very relevant consideration here in the Okanagan.
Yes.
All right, we are going to wrap up our webinar. We really appreciate everyone's engagement with today's workshop. Thank you for all of your excellent questions. And of course, if you have more questions and follow-up, we would love to hear from you via email. All of our email addresses are listed at the bottom of the screen under our photos here. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to our presenters, Nicole and Alyssa. You presented the work very well, answered the questions at a very high level, and I think what you shared was very informative and useful for the audience, so thank you for that. Behind the scenes, we would like to also extend applause and thank you to Jessica Lattis and Mairead Norton, both for their organizational prowess in putting this, getting this webinar together and off the ground, and also for their excellent technical support. We'd furthermore like to thank everyone who has joined us over the past 3 days for this workshop series. Finally, feel free to visit the BC Food Web at bcfoodweb.ca to learn more about the Food Web and about future webinars similar to this one. So I wish you all a wonderful Thursday afternoon, and thank you for joining us.